if you want to make like a botanical discovery, you don't actually need a machete.
Right, no machetes required.
Yeah. And you don't need to mount some grand expedition to the Amazon basin either. You really just need a damp patch of grass and, well, an incredibly long memory.
Which is often the hardest part,
It
honestly.
really is. Okay, let's unpack this because today's deep dive is taking us into a really hyper-focused, incredibly intimate source.
Very intimate.
Yeah. We're looking at a single brief entry from a personal gardening journal. It's titled Notes on Gardening, Part 890, and it's authored by someone named Ang, published today, actually, May 10th, 2026.
Right.
For you listening, our mission today is to extract the hidden depths of everyday observation. We're going to explore how a completely unremarkable evening stroll can lead to, like, a masterclass in taxonomy.
And a critique of modern landscaping, too.
Exactly, and really just a rethinking of the very ground we walk on. Because the most profound insights, they aren't always hiding in, untouched wilderness.
No, not at all.
They are tucked away right in the forgotten edges of our own neighborhoods.
Yeah, and, the title of this source, Part 890, that immediately signals the type of data we are looking at here.
Oh, absolutely. 890 is a big number.
Right. Like a single entry might seem trivial on its own, but that number indicates a massive longitudinal data set of personal observation.
Yeah, this isn't just someone's first day in the garden.
Exactly. This isn't a beginner's isolated note. We are stepping into the middle of a continuous, multi-year documentation of the natural world.
Right.
And that shifts the context entirely. It reveals the slow, methodical process of how human perception actually evolves through a repeated exposure to the exact same environment.
Yeah, and the setting for this entry is just beautifully ordinary. I mean, Ang is just out for dinner.
Just walking along.
Right. They're walking along, not surveying the landscape, definitely not holding a magnifying glass or anything.
Right, just a normal evening.
And out of the corner of their eye, they spot this unique little flower thriving in a damp, grassy patch. And they identify it as the Malaysian False Pimpernel, or Torenia crustacea.
A very easily overlooked plant.
Yeah. But the real hook of this journal entry isn't just the discovery of the plant itself. It's the realization that this isn't a first encounter.
Right.
Ang realizes they actually wrote about this exact species way back in, quote, Part 38, many moons ago.
Many moons ago.
Yeah. I mean, I look at a journal like this as a kind of time machine. It's like reaching into the pocket of a winter coat you haven't worn in 3 years and pulling out a note you wrote to yourself.
That's a great way to put it.
Because back in Part 38, Ang had fully intended to collect a specimen of this false pimpernel for propagation, but the idea just, slipped their mind.
As things do.
Right. Hundreds of entries pass and the plant reappears. And I have to wonder, do we mischaracterize this as simple forgetfulness? Maybe nature requires a certain baseline of readiness from us before we can actually follow through.
That's an interesting thought.
Well, and the punchline of Ang's entry sort of proves the point, because Ang forgot to take a cutting this time, too.
Oh, yeah. Which is honestly what's so fascinating here. It's the psychological mechanism behind that kind of longitudinal observation.
What do you mean?
Well, in neuroscience, there is something called the reticular activating system, or the RAS.
Okay, the RAS?
Yeah. It's basically this network in the brainstem that filters out unnecessary information so the brain doesn't just get completely overwhelmed.
Because there's too much input all the time.
Exactly. Every single day, you walk past literally millions of data points. Blades of grass, cracks in the pavement, tiny flowers.
And you just don't see them.
Right. Your RAS filters them out as irrelevant background noise. But the act of journaling fundamentally rewrites that filter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, by writing down an intention in Part 38, Ang basically told their brain that this specific creeping plant mattered.
So it's logged in there somewhere.
Exactly. Even if the conscious mind forgot to take the cutting, the RAS logged the visual signature of the Torenia crustacea.
That is wild.
So, hundreds of entries later, on a totally distracted walk to dinner, the brain flags that tiny flower and pulls it right to the forefront of Ang's attention.
Because it remembered.
Yes. The journal provides a control variable. I mean, the plant itself hasn't changed its behavior in the years between Part 38 and Part 890.
It's just hanging out.
Right. It is still just sitting in the damp grass.
Yeah.
What has changed is the human observer's perceptual capacity.
And that observer's capacity has definitely expanded, because when Ang looks at the flower this time, the journal entry shows they aren't just seeing, like, a pretty purple speck on the ground.
No, they are seeing the actual biology.
Exactly. Ang notes that the Malaysian False Pimpernel belongs to the Linderniaceae family, and specifically points out its relationship to a cousin plant, the wishbone flower, or Torenia furneri.
Right, the cousin.
Yeah, Ang describes them as sharing a similar snapdragon-like flower shape. And, instead of looking at plant families like a human family tree, I actually find it more helpful to think about them like architectural building codes.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, because if you look at a towering skyscraper and, say, a single-story bungalow built in the same city, the exteriors look completely different.
Obviously.
But if you look at the underlying electrical grids, the plumbing requirements, the structural foundation rules...
They follow the exact same municipal code.
Exactly. And in botany, that municipal code is the reproductive structure.
Right, and that structural code is deeply, deeply conserved by evolution. I mean, the snapdragon-like shape Ang observes is a perfect example of what botanists call bilateral symmetry.
Okay, bilateral symmetry. Break that down for us.
Sure. So unlike a daisy, which has radial symmetry,
Like a circle.
right, and looks the same from any angle, a bilaterally symmetrical flower has a distinct left and right, top and bottom.
Okay.
It is shaped almost like a complex face, or a tube with a specialized lip.
Interesting.
This is just an aesthetic quirk, It is a highly engineered mechanical adaptation.
Wait, really? Mechanical?
Yeah. Bilateral symmetry basically evolved as a targeted landing pad for very specific pollinators.
Oh, I see.
The lower lip of that snapdragon shape acts like a weighted trapdoor.
No way.
Yes. When a bee of the correct size lands on it, its weight pulls the lip down, opening the flower and forcing the insect to brush against the pollen-bearing anthers in a highly, highly precise sequence.
Wow, so it's practically a machine.
It really is. It's an evolutionary lock and key.
Right.
Recognizing the Linderniaceae family means recognizing that deeply embedded biological blueprint.
Right.
Whether the plant is a foot tall or an inch tall, if it belongs to this family, it will utilize that specific, highly evolved pollination mechanism.
Okay, but hold on. If they share the exact same structural foundation, the exact same evolutionary lock and key blueprint for their flowers,
Yeah.
why does one cousin stand up proudly in a garden bed while the other literally drags itself through the damp grass? Because Ang specifically notes that the wishbone flower is upright, while our Malaysian False Pimpernel has a creeping growth habit.
Right, so the variation in the exterior, to borrow your architectural analogy, is a response to the neighborhood.
The ecological niche.
Exactly. An upright growth habit, like the wishbone flower, prioritizes visibility. It invests biological energy into building sturdy vertical stems.
Reach here for the sun.
Yeah, utilizing complex compounds like lignin and cellulose to reach sunlight and attract pollinators from a distance.
Makes sense.
But the evolutionary trade-off is that an upright plant is highly vulnerable. It can be easily snapped by wind, eaten by herbivores, or, destroyed by a single footstep.
Right, it's just out there exposed.
Exactly. A creeping growth habit, on the other hand, is an adaptation for survival in hostile, competitive, or frequently disturbed environments.
Like a sidewalk edge.
Yes. A creeping plant hugs the ground, keeping a low profile to evade grazing animals. And more importantly, creeping plants utilize structures like stolons.
Stolons!
Yeah, they're stems that grow horizontally along the soil surface. Wherever a node on that stem touches damp ground, it has the capacity to send down adventitious roots.
It's building a redundancy network.
Precisely a redundancy network. If a grazing animal or a careless human steps on the middle of the stem and severs it,
it doesn't die.
Right, the plant doesn't die. The disconnected segments have already rooted themselves and simply continue growing as independent clones.
That is so smart.
It is a highly efficient, resilient survival strategy for the exact damp, high-traffic, grassy patches where Ang spotted it.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting, because Ang takes that biological observation about creeping plants and aims it directly at modern landscape design.
Yeah, this was a great pivot in the journal.
Right. Ang states in the journal that the Malaysian False Pimpernel operates as a creeping ground cover and argues it is a, quote, better, more vibrant alternative to standard cowgrass.
Cowgrass.
Yeah, and for you listening, cowgrass, or Axinopus compressus, is a broad-leafed, utilitarian turf grass that basically dominates lawns in tropical and subtropical
It's
regions.
everywhere.
Everywhere. It forms a thick, uniform, aggressive mat, and we seem to have this collective societal obsession with pouring endless amounts of water, chemical fertilizers, and weekend labor into maintaining these sterile, monolithic green carpets.
We do. We just accept it.
We just accept it as the default setting for outdoor space. But Ang is looking at this tiny, bilaterally symmetrical, redundantly rooting flower in the damp grass and asking a massive question.
Which is,
Why are we settling for utility when we could have a vibrant, flowering, self-sustaining alternative?
yeah, and the tension there is really between the ecological cost of aesthetic uniformity and the functional utility of microecosystems.
Break that down.
Well, cowgrass is undeniably tough. I mean, it evolved to handle heavy foot traffic and rapid defoliation, which makes it structurally suited for, say, a sports field.
Right, you need that for soccer.
Exactly. The problem arises when we apply the logic of a sports field to every single residential lawn and roadside verge.
Oh, yeah.
A monoculture of turf grass is, from an ecological perspective, a desert. It offers almost no nectar or pollen, and its dense mat basically prevents other seeds from germinating.
So nothing else can live there.
Right, so when Ang suggests a false pimpernel as a vibrant alternative, it is an argument for biodiversity. A creeping ground cover with flowering structures creates a complex microecosystem.
It's doing more work.
Much more. The canopy of the small leaves creates a living mulch that shades the soil, dramatically lowering the ground temperature and reducing water evaporation compared to just exposed dirt or closely cropped grass.
Wow.
Simultaneously, those snapdragon-shaped flowers we talked about provide a continuous food source for native, specialized pollinators that simply cannot survive in a purely grass-dominated landscape.
They'd starve otherwise.
Exactly. Ang is essentially proposing a paradigm shift in how we evaluate the success of a lawn, measuring it by its biological activity rather than just its uniform flatness.
That drastically changes how you look at the ground. I mean, imagine walking out your front door and instead of a flat expanse of green, you have a textured, living tapestry of blue and purple
That
flowers.
sounds beautiful.
And it's doing the work of moisture retention and pollinator support completely on its own. But doing that requires fighting against centuries of conditioning regarding what belongs in a yard and what doesn't. We have been taught to view any creeping plant that breaks the visual uniformity of turf grass as a failure of maintenance.
Right, as a problem to be fixed.
Exactly. The moment the false pimpernel creeps out of the damp patch and into the lawn, society labels it a weed. But Ang's journal entry completely bypasses that prejudice.
Which is so important because the label weed has absolutely no botanical meaning.
Not at all.
None.
Huh.
It is purely a measure of human inconvenience.
Ah,
By identifying the plant's family, understanding its floral mechanics, and recognizing its ecological potential as a ground cover, Ang elevates the organism.
it gets a promotion.
Basically, yeah.
Hmm.
It ceases to be an intruder and becomes an asset. This is the power of nomenclature and observation. Naming something accurately is really the first step in dismantling the default biases we hold against the natural world.
And despite all of that profound insight, the naming, the ecological reimagining, we still have to confront the reality of how Ang actually ends this journal entry. So what does this all mean? We have this meticulous progression of thought. Ang remembers the initial encounter in part 38. They trace the architectural codes of the Linderniaceae family. They envision a biodiverse alternative to the sterile monoculture of cowgrass.
The stage is perfectly set for action.
It's perfectly set. And then Ang writes, I didn't grab a sample for propagation this time either. It's definitely a plant worth exploring in the future. Till the next post, yours truly, Ang.
Yeah.
I mean, it is such a stark pivot from high-level botanical theory to pure, unresolved human delay. Years after making the mistake of leaving the plant behind, Ang consciously repeats the exact same inaction.
It's so relatable, though.
It really is.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that inaction highlights the immense contrast between the hyper-efficient survival mechanisms of the plant world and the slow, wandering nature of the human learner.
Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, the Malaysian False Pimpernel doesn't hesitate. As we discussed, the moment its nodes touch damp soil, it sends down roots.
Boom, redundancy network.
Boom. It secures its position. It optimizes its environment instantly.
Right.
The human gardener, however, operates on a wildly different timeline. We view learning and cultivation as this linear to-do list.
Step 1, step 2.
Exactly.
Hmm.
We expect Ang to identify the plant, harvest the cutting, propagate it, and finalize the project. But the reality documented in Part 890 is that genuine engagement with the natural world is cyclical, and it's inefficient.
And there is an immense philosophical comfort in that inefficiency, I think.
Also,
Well, the damp patch of grass and the creeping Torenia crustacea, they will continue their complex biological processes regardless of Ang's schedule.
sure.
The ecosystem doesn't collapse simply because the human forgot to take a cutting.
Right, it just keeps going.
Yeah, that takes all the pressure off. By failing to take the cutting, Ang inadvertently guarantees that the relationship with this specific patch of earth remains open. It's an unfinished loop.
I love that. An unfinished loop.
The plant is still out there, which means there is a reason to take another walk. There is a reason to pay attention tomorrow, or in Part 881 or Part 1000.
Yeah.
It frames gardening not as the act of permanently dominating a landscape, but as an ongoing negotiation with it. The plant provides the steady baseline. It just sits there, deploying its stolons and opening its bilateral flowers. The variable in the equation is the observer.
And that actually brings us to the ultimate function of longitudinal documentation.
Right.
The value of a journal spanning hundreds of entries isn't just a record of what plants look like. It is a meticulously detailed map of the observer's shifting consciousness.
Wow.
Because the Ang, who wrote Part 38, saw a pretty flower and had a fleeting desire to possess it. The Ang, who wrote Part 890, understands the evolutionary mechanics of the Linderniaceae family and challenges the ecological validity of the modern lawn.
And the flower remained identical the whole time.
Exactly. The architecture didn't shift. The only thing that evolved was the human capacity to comprehend what they were looking at.
That is the core of it. The plant didn't change. The gardener did. And that brings us full circle on the journey we've taken today with this incredibly dense single piece of source material.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. For you listening, we've started with a seemingly trivial observation of a damp patch of grass on a walk to dinner. We unpack the neurological magic of how a journal trains the brain to notice the forgotten background details of the world.
Right, the RAS.
Yep. We looked at the strict architectural building codes of plant taxonomy, specifically the targeted lock and key mechanics of the snapdragon-shaped flower.
Which is amazing.
Truly. We contrasted the energy-intensive vulnerability of standing plants with a highly redundant, resilient networking of creeping ground covers.
Yeah.
And we explored the massive ecological trade-offs between the sterile, monolithic dominance of standard cowgrass and the vibrant, moisture-retaining micro-ecosystems offered by the plants we so often dismiss.
It just demonstrates that you do not need a vast volume of text to uncover complex systems.
No, you don't.
A few sentences outlining a simple observation contain the blueprints for evolutionary biology, ecological critique, and human psychology.
I want to leave you with a final thought today, a direct challenge drawn from Ang's experience out there on the pavement.
Okay.
Think about the edges of your own daily commute. Think about the cracks in the sidewalk outside your office, or the neglected, damp corners of your own yard that you walk past every single day.
They're everywhere once you start looking.
They really are. What if the sprawling ground covers currently creeping along those edges are actually vibrant, highly evolved alternatives just waiting to be properly identified?
Right.
Could the very things you continuously pass by or repeatedly forget to propagate be the exact elements needed to transform the ecological health of your own landscape? The expedition is happening right beneath your feet. You just have to be willing to look a little closer at the damp, grassy patches in your own life. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Till next time.